This is Black Wall Street Chronicles, and we're back at it again. Hi, thank you for stopping by and watching this YouTube stream. I would like to thank all of my subscribers for support. I would like to thank you for not only watching my streams on YouTube, also I would thank you guys for listening to my podcast. My podcast, Black Wall Street Chronicles, is on anchor.com. You can listen to the podcast for free on Spotify. You can listen to the podcast for free on on having a brain fart. You can listen to it on Apple. You can listen to it on Spotify. You can listen to it on Google Play, or you can listen to my podcast on the NewYorkCityPodcast.com. All right. So, in today's episode, we're going to talk about the history of R&B. Blues has always been a favorite of mine, and I decided to talk about the history of R&B because many people don't know about rhythm and blues, where it comes from, the different types of rhythm and blues, and if rhythm and blues is going to make a comeback, because it kind of fell off after a couple of years, but it's okay. Give me 1 second. All right, here we go. Rhythm and blues. Rhythm and blues, often abbreviated as R&B or R&B, is a genre of popular music that originated in African American communities in the 1940s. The term was originally used by record companies to describe recordings marketed predominantly to urban African Americans, at a time when urban, rocking, jazz-based music with a heavy, insistent beat was becoming more popular. In the commercial rhythm and blues music typical of the 1950s through the 1970s, the bands usually consisted of piano, one or two guitars, bass, drums, and one or more saxophones, and sometimes background vocalists. R&B lyrical themes often encapsulate the African American experience of pain and the quest of freedom and joy, as well as the triumphs and failures in terms of relationships, economics, and aspirations. The stylistic origins of rhythm and blues is jazz, blues, spiritual, gospel, boogie woogie, jazz, jump blues, swing. The derivative forms of rhythm and blues is funk, aka doo-wop, soul, rock and roll, reggae, disco, beat music, mob revival, hip hop, zydeco. The subgenres are contemporary R&B, smooth jazz, alternative R&B, and neo soul. The term rhythm and blues has undergone a number of shifts in meaning. In the early 1950s, it was frequently applied to blues records. Starting in the mid-1950s, after this style of music contributed to the development of rock and roll, the term R&B became used to refer to music styles that developed from incorporated electric blues, as well as gospel and soul music. In the 1960s, several British rock bands such as the Rolling Stones, The Who, and The Animals were referred to and promoted as being R&B band posters for the Who's residency at Marquis Club. In 1964, contained the stolen Maximum R&B. Their mix of rock and roll and R&B is known as British Rhythm and Blues by the end of the 1970s. The term rhythm and blues had changed again and was used as a blanket term for soul and funk in the late 1980s. A new style of R&B developed, becoming known as contemporary R&B. It combines rhythm and blues with elements of pop, soul, funk, disco, hip-hop, and electric music. Although Jerry Wexler of Billboard magazine is credited with coining the term rhythm and blues, it was a musical term in the United States in 1948. The term was used in Billboard as early as 1943. It replaced the term race music, which originally came from the black community but was deemed offensive in a post-war world. The term rhythm and blues was used to Billboard its chart listings from June 1949 to August 1968, with its hot rhythm and blues singles chart renamed as best-selling soul signals. Before rhythm and blues was named instead, various record companies had already begun replacing the term race music in separate series. Writer and producer Robert Palmer defined rhythm and blues as a catch-all term referring to any music that was made by or for Black Americans. He has used the term R&B as a synonym for jump blues. However, all music separates from its jump blues because of R&B's gospel influences. Lawrence Cohen, author of Nothing But the Blues, writes that rhythm and blues was an umbrella term invented for industry convenience. According to him, the term embraced all black music except classical music and religious music, unless a gospel song sold enough to break the charts. As well into the 21st century, the term rhythm and blues continue its use in some contexts to categorize music made by black musicians as distinct from styles of music made by other musicians. In the commercial rhythm and blues music typical of the 1950s to the 1970s, the bands usually consist of piano, one or two guitars, bass, drums, and saxophones. Arrangements were reversed to the point of effortlessness and were sometimes accompanied by background vocalists. Simple rhythm and partial mesh creating momentum and rhythmic interplay producing mellow lilting and offering hypnotic textures while calling attention to no individual sound. While singers are emotionally engaged with the lyrics, often intensely so, they remain cool, relaxed, and in control. The band's dressed in suits, evening uniforms, a practice associated with the modern popular music that rhythm and blues performers aspire to dominate. Lyrics also seem fatalistic, and the music typically follow predictable patterns of chords and structure. One publication of the Smithsonian Institution provided a summary of the origins of the genre in 2016. It is a distinctly African American music drawn from the deep tributaries of African American expressive culture. It is an amalgam of jump blues, big bang swing, gospel, boogie, and blues that was initially developed during the 30-year period that bridges the era of legally sanctioned racial segregation, international conflicts, and the struggle for civil rights. The term rock and roll has strong sexual connotation in jump blues and R&B, but when DJ Adam Freed referred to rock and roll in mainstream media radio in the mid-1950s, the sexual component had been dialed down enough to it simply became an acceptable term for dancing. The Great Migration of Black Americans to the urban industrial centers of Chicago, Detroit, and New York City, Los Angeles, and somewhere in the 1920s and 1930s, created a new market for jazz, blues, and related genres of music. Yeah, right when I'm streaming. Give me a second, guys. Hello? Sorry about that. The Great Migration of Black Americans to the urban industrial centers of Chicago, Detroit, and New York City, Los Angeles, elsewhere in the 1920s and 1930s, created a new market for jazz, blues, and related genres of music. These genres of music was often performed by full-time musicians, either working alone or in small groups. The precursors of rhythm and blues came from jazz and blues, which overlapped in the 1920s and 1930s through the work of musicians such as the Harlem Habfats, with their 1936 hit "Oh Red," as well as Lonnie Johnson, Leroy Carr, Cobb Calloway, Count Basie, T-Bone Walker. There's also increased emphasis on the electric guitar as a lead instrument, as well as the piano and the saxophone. In the late 1940s, 1948, RCA Victor was marketing black music under the name Blues and Rhythm, and in that year, Louis Jordan dominated the top 5 listings on R&B charts with 3 songs, and 2 of the top 5 songs were based on boogie-woogie rhythms that had come to prominence during the 1940s. Jordan's band, the Tiffany Five, formed in 1938, consisted of the saxophone and vocals, along with musicians on trumpet, tenor saxophone, piano, bass, and drums. Lawrence Cohen described the music as grittier than his boogie era jazz tingle blues. Robert Palmer describes it as urbane, rocking, jazz-based music with a heavy, insistent beat. Jordan's music, along with Big Joe Turner, Roy Baum, Brillie Wright, and Rayon Harris, is now referred as jump blues. Already, Paul Gaden, Roy Blount, and others had hits in the style known referred to rhythm and blues. In 1948, Rayon Harris' remake of Brown's 1947 recording, Good Rocking Tonight, reached number 2 in the charts, following band leader Sonny Thompson's Long Gone at number 1. The term rhythm and blues replaced the Billboard category Harlem Hit Parade, also in the year The Hucklebuck, recorded by band leader and saxophonist Paul Williams, was the number 1 R&B tune, remaining at the top of the charts for nearly the entire year. Written by musician and arranger Andy Gibson, the song was described as a dirty boogie because it was risky and raunchy. Paul Williams and his Hucklebucker concerts were sweaty, righteous affairs that got shut down more than one occasion. I remember that song. It was on the Honeymooners. Do the Hucklebuck, do the Hucklebuck, do the yard out of luck. That's how it goes, I guess. Their lyrics by Roy Alford wrote the 1955 hit The Rock and Roll Waltz were mildly sexually suggested, and one teenager from Philadelphia said that the Hucklebuck was a very nasty dance. Also in 1949, the new version of the 1920s blues song Ain't Nobody's Business was the number 1 4 hit for Jimmy Witherspoon and Louis Jordan, and the Tiffany Five once again made the top with Saturday Night Fish Fry. Many of these hit records were issued on new independent record labels such as Savoy. Founded in 1942, King, founded in 1943, Imperial, 1945, Specialty, founded in 1946, Chess, founded in 1947, and Atlantic, founded in 1948. Afro-Cuban rhythmic influence. African American music began incorporating Afro-Cuban rhythm motifs in the 1800s with the popularity of the Cuban contradanza, known outside of Cuba as a habanada. The habanada rhythm can be thought as a combination of teso and the backbeat. For more than a quarter century, in the cakewalk, ragtime, proto-jazz were forming and developing, the Cuban genre habanera exerted a constant presence in African American popular music. Jazz pioneer Jelly Roll Martin considered the treso habanada rhythm, which he called Spanish lingtine, to be an essential ingredient of jazz. There are examples of treso-like rhythms in some African American folk music, such as the hand clapping and foot stamping patterns of ring shout, post roll, drum, and fife music in the New Orleans second line music. Winston Marsalis considered treso to be the New Orleans clave, although technically the platter is only half a clave. Teso is the most basic duple pulse rhythm cell in Sub-Saharan African music traditions, and its use of African American music is one of the clearest examples of African rhythmic retention in the United States. The use of treso was continuously reinforced by the consecutive waves of Cuban music, which were adopted into North American popular culture. In 1940, Bob Sugg released Rum Boogie, a boogie-woogie with treso bass line, and lyrics probably declare the adoption of Cuban rhythm. Harlem's got a new rhythm, man, and it's burning the dance floors because it's too hot. They took a little rumba rhythm and added boogie woogie, and now look what they got. Room boogie. This whole new creation with the Cuban syncopation is killer. Just plant your both feet on each side, let both your hips and shoulder glide, and throw your body back and ride. There's nothing like room boogie, room boogie, woogie. In Harlem or Havana, you can kiss old Savannah. It's a killer. Mm. Although originally in the metropolis amount of Mississippi River, New Orleans blues, with its Afro Caribbean rhythmic traits, is distinct from the sound of Mississippi Delta blues. In the late 1940s, New Orleans musicians was especially receptive to Cuban influence precisely at the time when R&B was forming. It was first use of trestle on R&B and curl in New Orleans, Robert Palmer recalls. New Orleans producer band leader Dave Bartholomew first employed this figure as a saxophone section riff in his own 1949 disc County Boy. It subsequently helped make the most ever used rhythm pattern in the 1950s rock and roll. On numerous recordings by Fats Domino, Little Richard, and others, Bartholomew assigned this repeating three-note pattern not just to sing bass, but also electric guitars and even baritone sax, making it very heavy bottom. He recalls first hearing the figure as a bass pattern on Cuban disc. In a 1988 interview with Palmer, Bartholomew, where the first R&B studio band, revealed how he initially superimposed trestle over swing rhythm. I heard of the bass playing the part of Rumba record on Country Boy. I had my bass and drums playing a straight swing rhythm and wrote out the Rumba bass part of the saxes to play on top of the swing rhythm. Later, especially after rock and roll came along, I made the Rumba bass part heavier and heavier, and I have a string bass, an electric guitar, and a baritone in unison. Bartholomew referred to the Cuban sun by the misnomer Rumba, a commonplace of the time. Fat Domino's Blue Monday, produced by Bartholomew, is another example of the now classic use of treasure in R&B. Bartholomew's 1949 treasure-based O Cubanas is an attempt to blend African American and Afro-Cuban music. The word mambo, larger than any other test, is placed prominently on the record label, and its composition Misery. New Orleans pianist Professor Longhair plays a habanera-like figure in his left hand. The dope use of triplets is a characteristic of Longhair's long hair style. Godard Kubrick notes that with the exception of New Orleans, early blues lacked complex polyrhythms, and there was a very specific absence of astronomic timelines in virtually all the 20th century African American music, and only in some New Orleans genres does a hidden simple timeline pattern occasionally appear in the form of transient so-called stomp patterns or trine chorus. These do not function in the same way as African timelines. In the late 1940s, this charged somewhat, and the two-cell line structure was brought into the blues. New Orleans musicians such as Bartholomew and Longhair incorporated Cuban instruments, as well as the clave pattern and related two-celled figures in songs such as Carnival Day. Bartholomew, 1949, and Mardi Gras in New Orleans, Longhair, were some of the early experiments where aqua fusions and Afro elements were eventually integrated fully into New Orleans sound. Robert Palmer reports that in the 1940s, Professor Longhair listened to and played the musicians from the islands and fell under the spell of Perez Prado's Mamba records. He especially enamored with Afro-Cuban music. Michael Campbell states, Professor Longhair's influence was far-reaching. Several of his early recordings, Professor Longhair blended Afro-Caribbean rhythms with rhythm and blues. The most explicit is Longhair's Blues Rumba, where you always a straight floor blues with clave rhythm. Longhair's particular style was known locally as rumba boogie, and as Mardi Gras New Orleans, the piano employs 2/3 clave on-beat, offbeat motif in a rumba boogie. A straight subdivision feel of Cuban music, as opposed to swing subdivisions, took root in New Orleans R&B during this time. Alexander Stewart states that the popular felt was passed along from New Orleans through James Brown's music to the popular music of the 1970s, adding the single style of rhythm and blues that will emerge in New Orleans in the years after World War II played an important role in developing of funk and related development, the underlying rhythms of American popular music underwent a basic yet genetically unacknowledged transition from triplet or shuffle fill to even and straight eighth notes. Concerning the various funk motifs, Stewart states that this model is different from timeline, such as clave and treble, in that it is not exact pattern but more of a noose organizing principle. Johnny Otis released the R&B Mambo Boogie, in January 1959, featuring congas, maracas, claves, mambo saxophone, grottos, and blues progression. Ike Turner recorded Cubano Jump, an electric car instrumental, which is built around 2-3 clay figures adopted from the mambo, the Hawkettes, and Mardi Gras Mambo, featuring the vocals of young Art Novell, making a clear reference to Perez Prado and their use of his trademark in the break after the introduction. Neb Sublette states that Electric Blues Cats were well aware of Latin music, and there was definitely such a thing as rumba blues. You could hear Muddy Rollers and Hobble both playing it. He also cites Otis Rush, Ike Turner, Ray Charles as R&B artists who employed this feel. The use of clave in R&B coincided with the growing dominance of the backbeat and the rising popularity of Cuban music in the U.S. In a sense, clave can be distilled down to trezzlo, answered by the backbeat two-side. The Bo Diddley beat is perhaps the first true fusion of 3-2 clave and R&B rock and roll. Bo Diddley's subset asserts, in the context of time and especially those maracas, Bo Diddley has to be understood as a Latin ting record. A rejected cut recording the same session was tilted only rumba on the track sheets. Johnny Otis' Rillian Hand Jive is another example of successful blend of 3-2 claves and R&B. The Otis used the Cuban instruments, claves, and maracas on the song. Afro-Cuban music was the conduit by which African-American music was re-Africanized through the adoption of two-celled figures like clave and Afro-Cuban instruments like conga drum, bongos, maracas, and claves. According to John Roberts, R&B became the vehicle for the return of Cuban elements into mass popular music. Producer for Atlantic Records is reported to say that Afro-Cuban rhythms added color and excitement to the bass drive in R&B. As Ned Sublette points out, though, by the 1960s, with Cuba the object of the United States embargo that still remains in effect today, the island nation has been forgotten as a source of music. By the time people begin to talk about rock and roll as having a history, Cuban music has vanished from North American consciousness. That's sad. I'm going to talk about early, mid 1950s, the late 1950s. Yeah, I know where I'm going to go with this. The article's doing it for me. At first, the only African Americans were buying R&B discs, according to Jerry Wesker of Atlantic Records. Sales was localized in African American markets. There was no right sales, no radio play during the early 1950s. More white teenagers started to become aware of R&B to purchase the music. For example, 40% of the 1952 sales of Dolphin Hollywood record shop, located in African America or Los Angeles, were to whites. Eventually, white teens across the country turned their music tastes towards rhythm and blues. Johnny Otis, who has signed with Newark, New Jersey band Savoy Records, produced many R&B hits in 1951, including Double Crossing Blues, Mistrusting Blues, Cupid Boogie, all of hit number one last year. Otis scored top 10 hits that year. Others include G's Baby, Mambo Boogie, and All Night Long. The Clovers and Quintet consisted of a vocal quartet of accompanying guitarists, singing the center-sounding combination of blues and gospel. Had the number one five hit of the year, Don't Know I Love You on Atlantic, also in July 1951. Cleveland, Ohio DJ Alan Freed started a late-night radio show called the Moondog Rock House Party on WJW. Freed's show was sponsored by Fred Mintz, whose R&B record store had primarily African-American clientele. Freed began referring to the rhythm and blues music as he played rock and roll. In 1951, Little Richard Penman began recording RCA records in the jump blues styles of the late 1940s, stars Roy Brown and Britty Wright. However, it was not until he prepared a demo in 1954 that he caught the attention of Specialty Records, that the world will start to hear his new up-tempo, funky rhythm and blues that would catapult him to fame in 1955 and help define the sound of rock and roll. A rapid succession of rhythm and blues that hits follows, beginning with Tutti Frutti and Long Tall Sally, which would influence performers such as James Brown, Elvis Presley, and Otis Redding. Ruth Brown on the Atlantic label placed hits in the top 5 every year from 1951 through 1954. Teardrops from My Eyes, 5, 10, 15 Hours, Mama He Treats Your Daughter Mean, and What a Dream. Faze Adams' Shake a Hand made it to number 2 in 1952. In 1953, the R&B record Brian Public made Willie Mae Thornton's original recording of Lieber and Stoller's Heimdall, the number 3 hit that year. Ruth Brown was very prominent among female R&B stars. Her popularity was most derived because of deeply rooted vocal delivery in African American tradition. This same year, the Orioles, a doo-wop group, had the number 1 hit of the year with Crying in the Chapel. Fats Domino made the 30th charts in 1952 and 1953, then in the top 10 with Ain't That a Shame. Ray Charles came to national prominence in 1955 with I Got a Woman. Bill Burr, Bronzy, upset of Charles' music. He's mixing the blues with the spirituals. I know that's wrong. In 1954, the chorus Shaboom became the first hit. Early in the year, late in the year, into 1955, Hearts of Stones by the Charms made in the top 20. At Chess Records in the spring of 1955, Bo Diddley's debut record, Bo Diddley, I'm a Man, climbed to number 2 in the R&B charts and popularized Bo Diddley's own rhythm and blues clave-based vamp that will become a mainstay in rock and roll. At the urging of Leonard Chess and Chess Records, Chuck Berry had reworked a country fiddle tune with a long history entitled Ida Red. The resulting Maybelline was not only number 3 hit on the R&B charts in 1955, but also reached the top 30 of the pop charts. Alan Freed, who had moved into the much larger market in New York City in 1954, helped the record become popular with white teenagers. Freed had been given part of the writing credit by Chess in return for his promotional activities and common practice at the time. R&B was a strong influence in rock and roll, according to many sources, including an article in the Wall Street Journal in 1985. Rock is still rhythm and blues. In fact, the author stated that the two terms were used interchangeably until about 1957. The other sources quoted in the article said rock and roll combined R&B with pop and country music. Fats Domino was not convinced as to any new genre. In 1957, he said they can call rock and roll now rhythm and blues. I've been playing it for 15 years in New Orleans, according to Rolling Stone. That's a violent statement. At 50s rockers, black and white country born, city bred, were fundamentally influenced by R&B, the black popular music of the late 40s and early 50s. In 1956, the R&B Top Soars of 56 took place with headliners Al Hibbert, Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, and Carl Perkins, whose blue suede shoes was very popular with R&B music buyers. Some of the performers completing the bill were Chuck Berry, Kathy Carr, Shirley Ann Lee, Della Reese, Sam T. Bird Jensen, the Cleftones, and the Spanish with the Illinois Jacket Big Rockin' Rhythm Band. Cities visited by the tour included Columbia, South Carolina, Indianapolis, Maryland, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Syracuse, Rochester, and Buffalo, New York, and other cities. In Columbia, the concert ended with a near riot as Perkins began his first song as the closing act. Perkins is quoted as saying, "It was dangerous, a lot of kids got hurt." In Indianapolis, 7,000 to 50,000 people tried to attend a sold-out performance with 8,000 seats. Roosevelt clocks was 7 hours. Filmmakers took advantage of the popularity of rhythm and blues musicians as rock and roll musicians began in 1956. Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, Big Joe Turner, the Trainers, the Platters, the Flamencos, all have made it onto the big screen. Two Elvis Presley records made the R&B top in 1957, Jailhouse Rock, Treat Me Nice, and number 1, and All Shook Up at number 5. An unprecedented acceptance of non-African American artists into a music category known for being created by blacks. Nat King Cole, also a jazz pianist who had hits on the pop charts in early 1950s. Mona Lisa at number 2 in 1950 and Too Young at number 1 in 1951. Had a record in top 5 R&B charts in 1958. Looking back, do I like it? In 1959, two black-owned record labels, one which would become hugely successful, made their debut. Sam Cooke's star, Barry Gordon's Motown Records, Brooke Benton, was at the top of the R&B charts in 1959 and 1960 with number 1 and 2 number 1 hits. Benton had certain warmth in his voice that attracted to a wide variety of listeners. And his ballads led to comparisons with performers such as Nat King Cole, Frank Sinatra, and Tony Bennett. Lloyd Price, who was in 1952, had a number 1 hit with Liz Marty Claudy. Regarding predominance with a version of Stagger Lee at number 1 and Personality at number 5 were all in 1959. The white band leader of Bill Black combo, Bill Black, who helped Elvis Presley's career, and it was Elvis Bassett in the 1950s, was popular with black listeners. 90% of his record sales were from black people, and Smokey Part 2 rose to the number 1 position of black music charts. He was once told at a lot of these stations that you think you're a black group because it sounds funky and black. He did not feature on a combo or early records. Sam Cooke's number 5 hit Chain Gang is indicative of R&B in the 1960s. As prop rapper Chubby Checker's number 5 hit The Twist by the early 1960s. The music industry category periods known as rhythm as blues was being called soul music, or similar music by white lighters was later blue-eyed soul. Motown Records had its first million-selling single in the 1960s with the Miracle Shop Around. In the 1961, Stax Records had its first hit with Carla Thompson's Gee Whiz, Look at His Eyes. Stax's major hit, the Marquis instrumental Last Night, included the raucous Memphis soul sound, which Stax became known in Jamaica. Its R&B influenced the development of soca. In 1969, black culture rhythm and blues reached another great achievement when the Grammy first added the rhythm and blues category, giving academic recognition to the category. By the 1970s, the term rhythm and blues was being used as a blanket form of soul, funk, and disco. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, hip-hop started to capture the imagination of America's youth. R&B started to become homogenized with a group of high-profile producers responsible for most R&B hits. It was hard for R&B artists of this era to sell their music or even have their music heard because of the rise of hip hop, but some adopted a hip hop image, were marketed as such, often feature rappers to their songs. There was artists such as Usher, R. Kelly, Janet Jackson, TLC, Aaliyah, Destiny's Child, Tevin Campbell, and Mary J. Blige enjoyed success. L.A. Reid, the CEO of LaFace Records, was responsible for some of the R&B's great success in the 1990s in the form of Usher, TLC, and Toni Braxton. Later, Reid successfully marketed Boyz II Men. In 2004, 80% of the songs that topped the R&B charts were also on the top of Hot 100. That period was the all-time peak for R&B and hip-hop on the Billboard Hot 100 and the Top 40 radio. For about 2005 to 2013, R&B sales declined. However, since 2010, hip-hop has started to take from R&B sound, choosing to adopt a softer, smoothing sound, incorporated that traditional R&B with rappers such as Drake, was opened an entire new door for the genre. This sound has gained popularity and created great controversy by both hip hop and R&B and how to identify it. Jews in the business and the rhythm and blues. According to Jewish writer, music publishing executive, and songwriter Arnold Shaw, during the 1940s in the U.S., there was generally little opportunity for Jews in the WASP-controlled realm of mass communication. This is the article saying this, not me. WASP control realms of mass communication. But the music business was wide open for Jews as it was for blacks. Jews played a key role in developing and popularizing African American music, including rhythm and blues, and the independent record business was dominated by young Jewish men who promoted the sounds of black music. All right, y'all. And that is the history of rhythm and blues in the African American community. So, if you like this stream, please subscribe, please like button, please share it. This is information for anybody that wants to get into rhythm and blues and any form of music in the African American community and outside the African American community. This is Black Wall Street Chronicles, and I'm Jeffrey Frazier, signing off.